Imagine standing at the edge of a 400-foot cliff, the night burning red beneath you, and screams echoing through the smoke. You have no weapon, no backup, just a rope, your hands, and a prayer. Every instinct says, run. But instead, you climb back into the fire, again and again. That night, one man, unarmed, unwanted, and unshakable, did what an entire battalion couldn't. His name was Desmond Doss, and this is the story of how a single medic, armed only with faith and courage, lowered 75 men from hell. Before you look away, ask yourself, would you have done what he did? If your answer is maybe, then stay, because by the end of this story, you'll either believe in miracles or question everything you thought you knew about courage. This is Desmond Doss, the unarmed medic who lowered 75 men from hell. The story of Desmond Doss doesn't begin on the battlefield. It begins with a boy who couldn't stand to see another human being suffer, even when that human was his own father. Long before the medals, before the headlines, before Hollywood ever whispered his name, there was a barefoot boy in Lynchburg, Virginia, staring at a picture of the 10 Commandments that hung on his family's wall. The words that pierced him most were simple. Thou shalt not kill. For most, it was just scripture. For Desmond, it was a vow, one that would haunt and guide him for the rest of his life. But war doesn't care about vows. It doesn't care about what you believe, only whether you're willing to pull the trigger. In 1941, as America bled into the Second World War, young men across the country lined up to enlist. They carried rifles, pride, and the burning need for revenge after Pearl Harbor. Desmond carried something else, a Bible, and the quiet conviction that he would never take a life. When he signed up, his own family thought he'd made a mistake. His neighbors called him a coward. His commanding officers called him a liability. But Doss didn't come to take lives. He came to save them. From the very first day of training, he stood out, and not in a good way. He refused to touch a gun. He refused to train on Saturdays, observing his Sabbath. He refused to curse, fight, or hate, and in the army that made him an outsider. They mocked him. They beat him. They called him Holy Joe. One sergeant once threw a boot at him and said, "If you won't pick up a rifle, you don't belong here." Doss only looked back, eyes calm and unwavering, and said, "I'll be near the front line, sir, just without one." That quiet defiance, that refusal to bend, made him a target. But it also made him unforgettable. And here's a question for you watching right now. Could you stand alone, surrounded by hate, mocked by your own brothers, and still hold on to what you believe? Most of us say yes, until we're tested. But Desmond Doss, he didn't just keep his faith. He proved it in the most terrifying place on earth. If courage means doing what's right when it's hardest, then maybe, just maybe, we've been measuring bravery all wrong. If you believe courage isn't about the gun, it's about the heart, then prove it. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me till the end, because this story only gets darker and more unbelievable. By 1945, Desmond Doss had become a combat medic with the 77th Infantry Division. He'd earned the reluctant respect of a few men, but many still saw him as dead weight. Then came Okinawa, a small island in the Pacific that would soon become one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The objective was simple. Take Hacksaw Ridge, a 400-foot cliff fortified by Japanese troops who would rather die than surrender. But nothing about Hacksaw Ridge was simple. The terrain was jagged and soaked with death. Bodies littered the ground like broken promises. Men vanished in the fog and smoke, screaming names that would never be answered.
When the call came for Doss's division to climb that ridge, even the bravest soldiers felt their stomachs twist. And somewhere in that chaos, Desmond Doss tightened the straps on his medic bag and whispered a prayer. No rifle, no sidearm, no guarantee he'd come back. Just faith, a rope, and his hands. They climbed. Gunfire erupted from the cliffs above, a storm of lead raining down. Men dropped like dominoes before they even reached the top. By nightfall, the ridge was a slaughterhouse, and when the order came to retreat, every man scrambled to get off that cliff. Everyone except one. Desmond Doss stayed behind, alone, unarmed, and surrounded by enemy soldiers who would have shot him on sight. He could have escaped. He should have. But instead he whispered 6 words that would become legend. Lord, please help me get one more. And then he disappeared into the smoke. That night, through burning flesh and blinding pain, a single unarmed medic crawled across enemy lines, bandaged bleeding soldiers, dragged them through the mud, and, one by one, lowered them down that 400-foot cliff. Each time the rope burned his hands raw. Each time his knees buckled. Each time he could have stopped. But he didn't. Because somewhere in that hellfire, Desmond Doss believed that saving one more man, even one more, was worth dying for. And by the time the sun rose, 75 souls had lived because one man refused to kill. If you're still here, think about this. When men with rifles ran, an unarmed medic stayed. When others lost faith, he held his ground. Would you have? If stories like this remind you what courage really means, don't scroll away. Honor the forgotten heroes. Subscribe and join me as we proceed, where we go back to the boy who became a legend. Before Desmond Doss ever faced a battlefield, his war began inside a quiet Virginia home, where faith, fear, and violence lived under one roof. He was born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, a small town surrounded by rolling hills and hymns, a place where the church bell rang louder than the whispers of war. His mother, Bertha, was a gentle Seventh-day Adventist woman who taught him that every life had value. His father, William, was a World War I veteran haunted by the ghosts of his own battles, a man who drowned his pain in bottles and silence. And when William drank, peace vanished from the Doss home. Desmond would hide under the bed as his parents argued, his heart pounding while his father's rage echoed through the house. But on one unforgettable night, it wasn't shouting that froze him. It was the sound of a gun being loaded. William Doss, drunk and trembling, aimed a pistol at his wife. Desmond's small hands grabbed his father's arm, tears streaming down his face as he begged, "Please, Daddy, don't hurt Mama." He wrestled the gun away. His hands shook, his breath caught. He looked down at the weapon and realized just how close he'd come to breaking one of the 10 commandments that hung on the wall. From that day, Desmond swore he would never touch a gun again, not even in self-defense, not ever. That was the seed of conviction that no army could uproot. Years passed, and Lynchburg rolled through the Great Depression. Money was scarce, but faith was not. While other boys played with slingshots and rifles, Desmond carried a Bible and a medical kit. He spent his days helping neighbors, patching up injured animals and learning first aid from an old church manual. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a boy who couldn't stand to see anything or anyone suffer. But the world beyond Lynchburg was changing fast. By 1939, the drums of war thundered again across Europe, and though America hadn't yet joined the fight, Desmond could feel it coming, like a storm building over the horizon. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the whole nation erupted in rage and fear. Men enlisted overnight. Posters cried out, "Your country needs you." Desmond looked at those posters differently. He read them as a call not to kill, but to heal. His mother begged him not to go. His father, the veteran who once told him that war destroys more than bodies, tried to stop him. But Desmond had already decided. He said quietly, "While everyone else is taking life, I'll be saving it." At the enlistment center, soldiers laughed when he refused to pick up a rifle. The sergeant rolled his eyes and muttered, "You think you can go to war without a weapon? You're crazy." Desmond simply smiled and replied, "With respect, sir, I can't carry a gun, but I'll carry every man who needs help." That line, simple, humble, became his creed. He joined as a combat medic, determined to serve without compromising his beliefs. But the Army wasn't built for men like him. From the first day of training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, Doss was branded an outcast. He wouldn't drill on Saturdays, keeping his Sabbath. He refused to even touch a rifle during weapons training. His commanding officers saw him as a problem, a man who wouldn't obey orders. They tried to have him discharged on psychological grounds. They wrote reports calling him mentally unfit for combat. They cursed him. They mocked his prayers. Some soldiers even threatened him in the dark, whispering, "When we get to battle, Doss, you won't make it back." He could have quit. He could have walked away, but he didn't. When they called him weak, he smiled. When they humiliated him, he bowed his head and prayed for them. He said, "Lord, forgive them. They don't understand what I'm trying to do." Each night, when the barracks fell silent, Doss would kneel by his bunk. Even as his fellow soldiers threw boots and insults his way, he never stopped praying. Not for himself, but for them. And something strange began to happen. The same men who hated him started watching him. They saw his quiet discipline. They saw him cleaning wounds after long marches, sharing his rations, staying behind to help when others collapsed from exhaustion. They saw him live his faith instead of preaching it. Respect didn't come fast, but it came. In 1944, he was assigned to the 77th Infantry Division. That's where he met the woman who would change his life, Dorothy Schutte, a nurse who understood his conviction and admired his courage. They married before he shipped out to the Pacific. Before he left, she gave him a small Bible with her name inside. He carried it everywhere, through jungles, gunfire, and nightmares. That Bible would one day be found stained with blood and mud, but never left behind. When his transport ship sailed across the Pacific, Desmond stood on the deck, looking at the endless ocean. He had no weapon, no guarantee of survival, only a medic's bag, and a promise he made as a child, never to take a life. He whispered a prayer into the wind. "Lord, help me save just one." He had no idea that one would soon become 75. As the months passed, he served in Guam, Leyte, and finally Okinawa. Each battle was worse than the last. More bodies, more screams, more death. Yet Desmond stayed calm, moving through gunfire as though guided by something unseen. His commanding officer once said, "It's like he's untouchable out there. Everyone else hits the dirt, but Doss just walks into the smoke like he's on a mission from God." And maybe he was. But behind that faith was a man still haunted by his father's rage, his mother's tears. And that night, when he almost pulled a trigger. He wasn't fearless. He was faithful. And that's what made him unstoppable. When the orders came for the 77th Division to take Okinawa in April 1945, even hardened soldiers went pale.
The Japanese defense was brutal. Tunnels, machine guns, flamethrowers. Taking the ridge would mean facing death itself. Doss packed his medic kit and Bible. He prayed with his wife's letter in his pocket, and as his unit prepared to climb the 400-foot escarpment they would later call Hacksaw Ridge, he made peace with whatever awaited him up there. He didn't know that his name would one day be remembered in history books. He didn't know he'd save more lives than most soldiers ever took. He only knew this: if even one man cried out for help, he had to answer. Because for Desmond Doss, every scream in the dark was a calling, and he wasn't going to ignore it. What kind of man walks into war without a weapon? What kind of faith makes you kneel in front of men who hate you and pray for their safety? Desmond Doss wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying to keep a promise to God, to his mother, and to himself. And yet, that promise would soon take him to the very edge of hell. If you've made it this far, remember this: courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it kneels, bleeding, unarmed, and unbroken. The year was 1942. America was deep in the Second World War. Every newspaper headline screamed, "Enlist now." Every poster showed brave men charging forward, rifles in hand, bayonets gleaming under the sun. But one man was walking into the same war, without a single weapon. Desmond Doss had signed up not to take life, but to save it. And that decision would make him a target long before he ever saw an enemy face. When he first arrived at basic training, the barracks fell silent. Men stared, some laughed. "Where's your rifle, soldier?" a private jeered. Doss smiled politely and said, "I won't be needing one." That one line was enough to turn curiosity into contempt. Soldiers came to the army to fight. Desmond came to heal. But in a place built on obedience and aggression, a man without a weapon was an insult. The sergeant barked orders and Doss followed every one, except one. "Pick up your rifle, Private." He refused, not with anger, not with defiance, but with quiet conviction. He said, "Sir, I'm sorry. I can't touch a weapon. My faith forbids it." The sergeant's jaw clenched. "You're in the wrong damn place, Doss." The other recruits laughed. To them, he was a coward. To the officers, he was a problem that needed fixing. And for weeks they tried. They called him names. They mocked his prayers. They spat near his boots. When he knelt to pray, they threw shoes at him. When he walked through the mess hall, trays went silent. He was the outcast of his own unit. One night someone whispered in the dark, "If we go to battle with him, he's going to get us killed." Doss heard it. He didn't argue. He just kept praying. He prayed for the same men who wanted him gone. He prayed they'd live long enough to see what faith could really do. But the cruelty didn't stop. Officers tried to discharge him, called him mentally unstable, unfit for duty. They demanded he sign papers agreeing to leave voluntarily. He refused again. He said, "No, sir. I'll stay. My country needs medics too." The more they pushed, the stronger he became, because deep down Doss knew this was a different kind of battle, not fought with bullets, but with conviction. The harassment reached its peak one cold evening. His sergeant stormed into the barracks shouting, "You're a disgrace to this uniform, Doss. Men like you don't belong in my army." Every soldier turned to look. Doss stood there, hands steady, eyes fixed forward. "With respect, sir," he said softly, "I'm willing to go into the same battle as any of you. Only difference is, I'll be saving your lives instead of taking others." The room went silent. Not a single man moved.
For the first time, his words hit harder than any bullet. The sergeant said nothing more that night. But the next morning, Doss's gear was thrown out into the mud. Someone had scrawled a note across his cot. Coward. He picked it up, brushed off the dirt, and whispered, "Lord, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Weeks later, during field training, something unexpected happened. A recruit tripped on barbed wire and sliced his leg open badly. Blood poured out. The men panicked until Doss sprinted to him. In seconds, he tore his own sleeve, wrapped the wound, and stabilized the bleeding with a belt tourniquet. The medic instructor froze in shock. This coward had just saved a man's leg using nothing but instinct and calm. From that day, whispers spread. "He knows what he's doing. He's crazy, but he's good." They still mocked his faith, but now they watched him closely. They couldn't deny the skill. They couldn't deny the courage. And slowly, respect began to take root. But command wasn't done testing him. When the unit was ordered to rifle qualification, Doss again refused to pick up a gun. The captain exploded, shouting, "What kind of soldier refuses to fight?" Desmond's answer was quiet but unbreakable. "I'm here to serve, Captain, not to kill." The captain stared, fists clenched. "Then you'll serve court-martial, soldier." And he nearly did. But higher command intervened, ruling that the Constitution allowed his service as a conscientious objector. He would be allowed to serve as a combat medic, unarmed. That decision changed everything. The Army couldn't throw him out, so they'd have to take him with them into war. When his unit deployed to the Pacific, every man wondered the same thing. Would Doss really stand his ground in battle, or would he run the moment bullets started flying? They got their answer soon enough. In Guam, under heavy enemy fire, Doss ran across open ground to treat wounded soldiers. He dragged one man nearly 100 yards under machine gun fire, bullets snapping around him like angry hornets. Not once did he hesitate. In Leyte, he worked for 3 straight days without rest, treating dozens of wounded. When shrapnel tore through his leg, he refused evacuation. He tied his own wound and kept working. By the time they reached Okinawa, the soldiers who once called him a coward now called him Doc. The same sergeant who had cursed his name quietly admitted, "If I'm ever hit out there, I hope it's Doss who finds me." Imagine that. The man they mocked, threatened, and tried to break, now the one they trusted with their lives. Think about that kind of strength. Not the strength to pull a trigger, but the strength to stay true when everyone else doubts you. The kind of courage that doesn't shout, it endures. Desmond Doss didn't win arguments. He didn't fight his fellow soldiers. He just outlived their hate and turned it into respect. And as fate would have it, those same men would soon follow him into one of the most terrifying battles in human history, Hacksaw Ridge. They didn't know it yet, but the man they once called coward would become the only reason most of them lived to tell their story. Stay with me as we step into the nightmare that would test every promise Desmond ever made and show the world what faith looks like under fire. Before you scroll, ask yourself, if everyone around you doubted your conviction, would you still stand by it? If the answer is yes, prove it. Subscribe to Mission America and honor the courage of one man who refused to hate, even in hell. April 1945. The final act of the Pacific War. The island of Okinawa, small, green, and beautiful, was about to become a graveyard for nearly 200,000 souls. For the men of the 77th Infantry Division, it was called a strategic assault. For the men who fought there, it was simply hell. And for one medic, named Desmond Doss. It was destiny. At dawn, the 77th moved toward the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot cliff the Japanese had fortified into a fortress of nightmares. The soldiers called it Hacksaw Ridge, because that's what it did to anyone who tried to climb it. The base of the cliff was littered with burned-out tanks, twisted helmets, and the smell of death that no wind could wash away. Men stood at the bottom, staring upward, whispering prayers they didn't believe in anymore. Desmond stood among them, clutching his medic's bag, a rope coiled over his shoulder, and his small Bible tucked near his heart. Someone sneered, "You really think that book's gonna stop a bullet, Doss?" He looked up calmly. "No, but it'll help me save the man who gets hit by one." The climb was brutal. The ridge was nearly vertical, covered in mud slick with blood. Men slipped, cursed, clawed their way upward, and at the top, the world exploded. Machine guns, mortars, grenades. Japanese soldiers burst from tunnels like ghosts of vengeance. The air turned to fire. Men screamed. Orders vanished in the roar. The battlefield became chaos. Within minutes, entire platoons were shredded. Flamethrowers lit bunkers like torches. Bodies fell back down the cliff, their screams swallowed by smoke. The 77th was told to hold the line. But there was no line left to hold. As medics scrambled for cover, Doss ran toward the wounded. Bullets snapped past his head, dirt exploded under his knees, but he didn't flinch. He moved from man to man, bandaging wounds, dragging the living away from the dead. Someone yelled, "Medic! Medic!" He was already there. His hands were covered in blood, not his own, and his voice steady. "You're gonna be all right, buddy. Hold on." Everywhere he went, he brought a flicker of hope in a place that had forgotten what hope looked like. By evening, the attack failed. The order came to retreat. Hundreds of wounded men were left scattered across the ridge, moaning, bleeding, begging for help. Every survivor scrambled down the cliff. Except one. Desmond Doss stayed, alone, unarmed, surrounded by hundreds of Japanese soldiers still hunting through the smoke. He could have gone down with the others. He could have saved himself. But as he looked across the battlefield, he saw movement, a hand twitching, a body gasping. He whispered, "Lord, please help me get one more." And then he crawled back into the fire. Hour after hour, Desmond searched the carnage. The battlefield was silent except for groans and distant gunfire. Each time he found a man alive, he patched the wounds, tied the ropes, and dragged them to the cliff's edge. He looped the rope around each wounded soldier, lowered them carefully down, inch by inch, whispering prayers between gasps of exhaustion. The rope burned his palms. His knees tore open on jagged rocks. But he didn't stop. When his arms trembled too much to hold the rope, he prayed again. "One more, Lord. Help me get just one more." And somehow, his body obeyed. He saved one, then another, then another. Each time he lowered a man to safety, he turned back into the smoke. At the bottom of the ridge, soldiers watching from below couldn't believe their eyes. Every few minutes, another wounded man descended on the rope, barely conscious but alive. No one knew who was sending them down. They whispered, "It's Doss. It's gotta be Doss." And soon the whisper turned into awe. By midnight, Japanese patrols were combing the ridge. Doss hid behind broken bodies, holding his breath as enemy soldiers walked past. He could hear them murmuring in Japanese, see their shadows in the moonlight. He stayed still until they were gone. Then he crawled out, dragging another man to safety. One soldier had his leg nearly blown off. Doss carried him half a mile through crossfire. Another man had shrapnel in his neck. Doss gave him his own bandage and whispered, "You're not dying tonight." He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just kept moving, one wounded soul at a time. By dawn, his uniform was soaked in blood, none of it his own. His hands were shredded, his face pale, but he was still whispering that same prayer. "Please, Lord, help me get one more." When the sun rose, the smoke cleared and the men at the bottom counted the saved. 75. 75 men lowered by hand, through fire, over a 400-foot cliff, by one man without a weapon. When the unit regrouped, soldiers who once mocked him wept openly. The same sergeant who called him a coward walked up to him with tears in his eyes and said, "Doss, I didn't think you'd come back, but I'm damn glad you did." Doss smiled weakly and whispered, "I couldn't leave my men behind." Even his commanding officer, who once tried to have him court-martialed, later said, "I've never seen anything like it. It was as if God had his hand on him." When medics finally found Doss at the ridge's edge, he was half-conscious, hands torn to ribbons, his uniform in tatters. He tried to stand and collapsed. They lifted him onto a stretcher. He protested, "I still got a few more out there." He passed out before they could answer. The stories spread across the battlefield like wildfire. Word reached generals, then newspapers, then the world. But Doss didn't see himself as a hero. He said simply, "I just didn't want to see anyone die who could be saved." And in that one sentence, he defined a kind of bravery the world rarely understands. Think about this. An unarmed medic saved 75 men under fire, the same men who once laughed at him. He risked everything, not to take life, but to save it. Now, ask yourself, how many of us would crawl into the fire for someone who once mocked us? How many of us would choose compassion over revenge, faith over fear? Desmond Doss didn't carry a weapon. He carried conviction. And in a world built on violence, that made him unstoppable. He showed us that courage doesn't need a rifle, just the will to do what's right, even when no one else will. The sun had fallen, and with it, the last fragments of command. Smoke hung over Hacksaw Ridge like a funeral shroud. The air itself seemed to bleed. Every man who could still crawl had gone back down the cliff. Every man except Desmond Doss. He stood alone in the dark, one silhouette against the inferno, listening. All around him came the sounds of the forgotten, groans, coughing, the low rattle of men trying not to die. Farther away, Japanese voices drifted like whispers of death. They were searching, bayonets glinting in the firelight. The order had been clear, retreat. But his heart whispered a different command. He knelt, his hands trembling, not from fear but from exhaustion, and whispered, "Lord, please help me get one more." A faint cry rose over the wind. Doss moved toward it, crawling through mud and shattered helmets. He found the soldier half buried beneath rubble, his leg mangled by shrapnel. The man's eyes widened when he saw the medic. "Leave me," he gasped. "They'll kill you if they catch you." Doss shook his head. "Then I guess we better be quick." He wrapped the wound with trembling hands, cinched the tourniquet and lifted the man onto his back. The soldier screamed. Doss bit his lip and kept going. Bullets cracked in the distance, warning shots in the dark, but he didn't stop. When he reached the cliff's edge, he tied a loop of rope, hooked it under the man's shoulders and began lowering him down, inch by inch. His palms burned, his knees shook. But the rope moved steadily until the weight was gone, and voices below shouted, "Got him!" One down. He looked at the rope, then back at the smoking battlefield. "Just one more," he whispered. He turned back into the carnage. The ridge was a nightmare of half-light and shadow, craters, bodies, smoke. Flames licked the edges of the bunkers where Japanese soldiers still hid like ghosts. Every sound could be a friend or an enemy. He found another, unconscious, bleeding from the chest.
Doss dragged him by his web belt, inching over the dirt, keeping his head low. A flare burst overhead, white as lightning. He froze, breath held, as figures moved through the smoke only yards away. Then darkness again. He pulled the man toward safety, heart pounding so loud he feared they'd hear it. When the second man reached the edge and disappeared down the rope, Doss dropped to his knees and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Gunfire erupted behind him, short bursts. Japanese patrol. Doss dove behind a dead tree and held his breath as footsteps approached. He could hear them talking softly, see their shadows sway. One stopped just feet away, raised a flashlight and scanned the ground. The beam swept across Doss's boots. He didn't move, didn't blink. The soldier turned, said something in Japanese and walked on. When the sound faded, Doss exhaled slowly, his heart hammering like artillery. He crawled the opposite direction, deeper into the smoke, toward another faint cry for help. A mortar exploded nearby. The shockwave hurled him against a rock. For a moment the world went silent except for the ringing in his ears. He touched his face. Blood trickled down, but he was alive. He pushed himself up and kept moving. Near a crater he found a figure writhing on the ground, a Japanese soldier. His eyes met Doss's. Both froze. The man's rifle lay out of reach, but his hand moved toward a grenade at his belt. Doss raised his hands, whispering softly, "Easy, easy now." He inched closer, pulled out a bandage and pressed it to the enemy's bleeding chest. The Japanese soldier stared, stunned, his hand falling away from the grenade. For a moment, two enemies knelt together under the burning sky, bound by pain. Doss tied the dressing, then slid back into the darkness. He didn't know if the man lived, but he knew he had done what he was meant to do. Hours passed. He stopped counting time, he only counted men. Every few minutes he found another, sometimes alive, sometimes not. Each one he bandaged, lifted, dragged, or carried to the edge. His uniform was soaked through, blood, sweat, rain, mud. His arms trembled so badly he could barely grip the rope, but he refused to quit. Once, as he lowered a soldier, the rope slipped. The man dropped several feet and screamed in agony. Doss nearly lost his grip. The rope burned his palms raw. He bit down on the pain, muscles screaming, and eased the man the rest of the way. When the weight vanished, he collapsed, face first into the dirt, gasping. Then he prayed again. One more. By the time the first light crept across the ridge, the sky turned gray-blue, exposing everything he had hidden in shadow. Now there was no smoke to shield him, no dark to hide in. He could see how many still lay scattered across the field. Dozens. He rose to his feet, shaking, and began again, faster now, desperate, before the enemy saw him. He dragged one soldier, then another. A sniper's shot cracked past his ear. He fell flat, waited, then crawled again. Another shot, closer. The dirt puffed inches from his hand. He whispered, "Not yet, Lord, please, not yet." And he kept moving. The morning wind howled through the ridges. Every gust carried the stench of smoke and iron. Doss crouched behind a fallen tree, watching the ground ahead, open terrain littered with bodies. He had to cross it to reach the cries on the far side. Then he saw him. The Japanese sniper hidden among rocks, scanning for movement. Doss pressed his face into the dirt and waited. The sniper's rifle shifted. He fired once, a spark, a puff of dust near Doss's knee. The medic didn't move. The sniper scanned again, waiting for proof of life. When he turned away, Doss crawled an inch forward, then another, then another. Each inch was agony.
It took him 20 minutes to cross 30 feet.
By the time he reached the wounded soldier, a private barely out of his teens, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. The boy looked up at him through tear-streaked dirt. "I thought everyone left me," he whispered. Doss managed a weak smile. "Not everyone." He carried the boy back, crawling half the distance before standing and sprinting the last yards through gunfire. By the time he reached the cliff, his legs were jelly. He tied the rope, lowered the soldier, and fell to his knees as the weight left the line. "That's one more," he breathed. "One more." At noon, the sky turned white with smoke again. Shells fell across the ridge, shaking the ground, flinging dust and limbs into the air. Every explosion threw him back to the earth, but he would rise again and move. There was no more fear now, only rhythm. Find, bind, drag, lower, pray, repeat. Once he stumbled upon a medic's body, a friend he'd trained with. The man's medical pouch lay open, his hands still clutching a bandage he never got to use. Doss knelt beside him and closed his eyes. "I'll finish what you started," he whispered. He took the bandage, wiped the blood from it, and kept going. Later, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. Faint, broken, but real. "Doss! Over here!" He turned toward the sound, heart sinking. It was Sergeant Howell, the man who once tried to have him discharged. Doss ran to him. The sergeant lay pinned under debris, his leg crushed. When he saw Doss, his eyes filled with disbelief and guilt. "You're still up here. Why?" Doss didn't answer. He just smiled and said, "Let's get you home." He lifted the debris with both arms, every muscle screaming. Howell bit down on his uniform to muffle his pain. When Doss finally freed him, he dressed the wound, tied a splint, and began dragging him toward the cliff. A bullet whizzed by. Another hit the ground beside them. Doss shielded the sergeant's body with his own until the fire eased. When they reached the edge, Howell's voice cracked. "Doss, I'm sorry for everything I said." Doss just nodded. "Doesn't matter. You're safe now." He lowered Howell slowly, then collapsed beside the cliffside, sobbing for the first time in 2 days. There came a time when his body stopped listening to his mind. His arms locked up, his vision blurred. Every breath felt like glass in his lungs. He tried to stand and couldn't. He fell back against the dirt, staring up at the sky that had burned for 24 hours straight. The cries were still out there. He could hear them, distant, faint, like ghosts calling for mercy. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Please, one more." And somehow his legs moved again. He crawled, not walked, dragged, not carried. But he reached another man, then another. The last few soldiers barely weighed anything, not because they were light, but because he'd stopped feeling the pain. By the end of the second day, his fingers were split open, his palms raw and bleeding from the rope. Every nerve screamed, but he refused to stop. The 75th man was found near dusk, barely alive, his uniform soaked in blood. Doss wrapped him up, hoisted him onto his shoulders, and took one slow step at a time toward the cliff. The ridge that had once been filled with screams was now eerily silent. The Japanese had pulled back. Even they must have sensed something sacred had taken place on that ground. Doss reached the edge, tied the last rope, and began lowering his final brother. Halfway down, the rope slipped again. He screamed from pain but held on, every muscle tearing. He didn't stop until the soldier's boots touched the earth below. When he finally released the rope, his hands were shredded to the bone. He collapsed backward, staring up at the smoke-filled sky.
He whispered one last prayer, his voice trembling. "Thank you, Lord, for letting me get one more." Then he lost consciousness. Hours later, when the American forces returned to retake the ridge, they found him lying in the dirt, surrounded by empty bandages, broken helmets, and a trail of blood that led to the cliff's edge. Someone shouted, "It's Doss! We found him!" They lifted him gently, careful not to touch his blistered hands. He stirred weakly, his lips forming the same words over and over. "One more. Please. One more." When they carried him down, men who once mocked him took off their helmets and bowed their heads. They had never seen anything like it. No one had. When the count was done, the number stunned everyone. 75 men, lowered by one unarmed medic through fire, bullets, and hell itself. Commanders called it a miracle. The men called it faith. Doss called it duty. He refused to take credit, saying simply, "I couldn't hear them calling for help and not go." When asked how he did it, he only said, "I just kept praying. Lord, help me get one more." Think about this. 75 men survived because one man refused to let fear decide for him. One man who had no weapon, no protection, and no reason to go back, except compassion. Now ask yourself, would you crawl back into the fire for someone who once laughed at you? Would you risk everything for a stranger or an enemy who wouldn't have done the same for you? Desmond Doss didn't just save lives. He redefined courage. He made the impossible a choice. He proved that bravery isn't about how many you kill. It's about how many you refuse to leave behind. If this story moved you, if it reminded you what real courage looks like, then honor it. Subscribe. Share it. Because the world forgets heroes like Doss unless we keep their light burning. He went up that ridge with nothing but faith, and came back with 75 souls. The first light of morning touched the ridge like a secret. Gray mist rolled across the torn earth, softening the jagged edges of war. Somewhere among the burned trees and cratered soil lay Desmond Doss, motionless, caked in blood and mud, one hand still gripping a length of frayed rope. Around him bodies stirred. Men he had lowered through the night began to groan, realizing the sun had come back and, somehow, they were still alive. The stretcher-bearers moved carefully between them, whispering when they saw the slope. "Who did this?" one asked. Another pointed to the ridgetop where a single figure lay slumped beside a tree. "Him," he breathed. The soldiers climbed toward Doss, expecting a corpse. When they rolled him gently, his eyes flickered open, dry, distant, searching for the same light he'd prayed for all night. He whispered something none of them caught at first. They leaned closer. "Thank you for letting me get one more." He wasn't counting himself. They lifted him onto a stretcher, but he shook his head weakly. "There's others up there," he rasped. "Don't leave them." Even now, barely breathing, his hands raw and shredded, he was still thinking of the next man. The officer at his side, speechless, finally ordered 2 medics to stay with Doss and the rest to move on. They found another survivor 50 yards up, then another. Every few meters, a man who should have died now waited for rescue. The trail Doss left behind was not of footprints, but of lives. Down below, word spread fast. The battalion that had retreated in defeat the day before now looked up to see the impossible. Wounded comrades descending one by one through the night, the last of them arriving with the dawn. "Somebody stayed behind," one Marine said in disbelief. "Stayed behind and saved 75. That number would change with every retelling, 70, 80, more. No one really knew how to count miracles. They carried Doss to the aid station at the base of the ridge. The doctor leaned over him, stunned at the bruises, the cuts, the exhaustion that looked deeper than flesh. "Son," he asked softly, "how long were you up there?" Doss tried to think, hours blurred. "Till they were all down?" Then his eyes closed again. He awoke later to the sound of boots and distant shellfire. The battle wasn't over. While the rest of the division regrouped, medics worked to patch him enough to stand. But rest was a stranger to him. As soon as he could walk, he begged to go back up. "Desmond, you've done enough," his sergeant said. He shook his head. "They still need us." That was the pattern of his life, obedience to conscience over comfort. He climbed again into the smoke. This time the ridge was worse. Japanese artillery raked the slope. Mortars shattered the ground he'd saved men from the night before. Doss moved through it with bandages in one hand, his Bible in the other. Then came the blast. A grenade exploded near him, shattering his leg. He fell, his vision flashing white, but he didn't cry out. He tied a tourniquet from a rifle stock and waited, breathing through clenched teeth. Medics reached him hours later. He waved them away. "Help the others first," he said. He tried crawling back toward the lines himself, dragging his broken leg behind him. Each pull left a trail of blood and determination. Then, a shot. He felt it tear through his arm, the same arm that had lowered men to safety the night before. The bullet should have gone through his heart, but something small and square slowed it. When they finally reached him, they found a hole in the pocket of his uniform, and behind it, his little Bible, scorched but intact. By the time they carried him down, he was barely conscious. Yet even then he managed to hand his Bible to the soldier beside him. "Make sure it gets back to my wife," he whispered. The men who lifted him had seen death, courage, madness, but never this kind of calm. One said later, he looked like he was somewhere else already. Not afraid, just ready. They placed him among the wounded waiting for evacuation. As the stretcher swayed toward the shore, the same question whispered from one soldier to another. How did he do it? The sea breeze smelled of blood and salt that morning. Evacuation boats lined the shore, loading the broken bodies of men who had survived only by a thread and by one man's faith. Among them, Desmond Doss lay still on a stretcher, his face pale against the rising sun. The medics checked his pulse every few minutes, whispering, "He's still with us." Each jolt of the boat sent a new stab of pain through his shattered leg, but his mind wasn't on the pain. It drifted to the men he'd left behind on the ridge, their faces, their cries, the impossible prayers whispered through the night. As he closed his eyes, memories blurred with voices. "Give me one more, Lord." The rope burns on his hands throbbed as if the words were carved into his skin. Hours later, in a makeshift field hospital, he awoke under a canvas roof stained with smoke and blood. A nurse bent over him, startled by the flicker of life. "You're a lucky man," she murmured. He blinked slowly. "No, ma'am. Just blessed." She smiled sadly. "They're saying you saved 75 men." He looked away, his voice barely a whisper. "Wasn't me." But the word was out. The ridge that had broken entire battalions now carried his name on every soldier's lips. Not as a legend, but as a question. What kind of man refuses to kill, yet saves more lives than any rifle ever could? When command officers came to speak with him, Doss was embarrassed by the attention. "I just didn't want to see anyone die without help," he said. They shook their heads in disbelief. "You did more than help, Private. You gave this army a reason to believe again." Still, the cost of faith was not finished with him. His injuries were severe: shrapnel in his leg, a bullet through his arm, infections threatening to take both. Doctors debated amputation. He quietly refused. "I'll heal," he said, "if the Lord still needs me." In the weeks that followed, fever took him in and out of consciousness. The nights were long, haunted by the echoes of Okinawa, the cries, the gunfire, the endless climb. Sometimes he'd wake sweating, whispering prayers for the men he couldn't reach. Even in delirium, his heart never left the ridge. One morning, as he lay staring at the canvas ceiling, a familiar sound reached him, the rustle of paper. A chaplain entered, holding something small and weathered. "Private Doss," he said softly, "I believe this belongs to you." It was his Bible. Burned around the edges, the bullet still lodged in its pages. The chaplain smiled. "They found it on the field. One of the men you saved carried it down for you." Doss took it in trembling hands. For the first time since the ridge, he cried. "Guess it kept me safe both ways," he murmured. Months passed before he was strong enough to stand. When he finally did, the world beyond war seemed almost too quiet. He was sent home, honorably discharged, body broken, but spirit unshaken. The people who saw him limping down the streets of Lynchburg, Virginia, could never have guessed the storm he'd walked through. But word traveled faster than he did. By the time he returned home, newspapers had begun printing his story. "Unarmed hero saves 75 under fire. Conscientious objector turns savior." Headlines meant to inspire a nation still reeling from war, yet Doss himself wanted no part of glory. He avoided crowds. When asked for interviews, he said, "The credit belongs to God." It wasn't humility for show, it was conviction. The same quiet belief that had driven him up that ridge now drove him back into a life of simplicity. He farmed, prayed, healed slowly. His scars were reminders, not of pain, but of purpose. Then came the call that would change everything once more. President Harry S. Truman himself wanted to meet him. In October 1945, Desmond Doss stood, thin, pale, his arms still weak, before the President of the United States. The crowd at the White House was silent as Truman pinned the Medal of Honor to his chest. The first conscientious objector in American history to receive it. Truman leaned close, gripping his hand. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." The cameras flashed. The nation applauded. But Doss looked down, blinking back tears. He whispered the same words he had spoken so many times before. "Thank you, Lord. Just one more." He didn't mean another medal. He meant another soul to save. For the rest of his life, Doss lived quietly. He built a small home with his wife, Dorothy. He planted gardens, tended animals, and spoke rarely of war. When people asked why he had risked everything, his answer never changed. "When they were hurt, I couldn't just leave them. I figured the best way to show my faith was to act on it." In the years that followed, his body bore the cost of that choice. The infections from Okinawa left him weak, but his spirit never faded. He spoke at schools, to veterans, to churches, never with pride, but with gratitude, and always with a question. What would you have done if you'd been there? That question still echoes. It is not about war or medals or courage. It's about faith when faith costs you everything. About doing what's right, not what's easy. about saving lives, even when the world says you're a fool to try. So when you think of Desmond Doss, don't just remember the man who lowered 75 soldiers from hell. Remember the man who proved that faith without fear can move mountains, or in his case, lower them, one rope at a time. If this story reached you, if it stirred something deep, don't let it fade when the video ends. Click subscribe, not just to remember heroes like Doss, but to remind yourself of what humanity can be when one person refuses to give up on others. Because in every generation, the world needs someone to stand alone and whisper into the dark, "Lord, help me get one more." No one answered. Some said it was faith, others said it was stubbornness, or something beyond words. But in the quiet moments between shell bursts, each man found himself wondering what he might have done if it had been him on that ridge. Would he have gone back? Would he have stayed?
The war was over, but for Desmond Doss, silence was just another kind of battlefield. He came home not to parades or music, but to the hum of cicadas and the creak of the front porch in Lynchburg, Virginia. His mother met him at the door with tears in her eyes. His father, once broken by drink and guilt, stood beside her trembling. For a moment, the war, the wounds, the medals, all disappeared. It was just a son coming home. But the world didn't see what the uniform hid. Doss's body was a map of pain, scar tissue, missing flesh, lingering infection. Each morning he would struggle just to stand. Each night he would wake drenched in sweat, hearing the cries of men calling for a medic that might never reach them again. He didn't speak of it. He didn't have to. Dorothy, his wife, the one who had waited through the years of war, could see it in his eyes. They built a small life on a hill outside town. No television, no luxury, just a Bible on the table and a garden outside. Doss grew vegetables and shared them with neighbors. He fixed things for anyone who asked. He never once spoke of being a hero. When someone recognized him, he'd smile politely and change the subject. "What you did in the war," they'd say. "It's unbelievable." He'd shake his head. "I just did what needed doing." But his body never forgot. The infections from his wounds kept returning. The shrapnel lodged deep in his flesh left him in constant pain. Sometimes he would have to lie flat for days, unable to move, whispering prayers between shallow breaths. And yet somehow, he never lost his gratitude. He'd look out the window at the sunlight breaking over the hills and say softly, "It's a good day." For years, the world forgot him. History has a cruel way of moving on, trading true stories for newer ones. While nations celebrated generals and presidents, the quiet medic from Virginia faded into memory. But faith like his never really disappears. It lingers, like a spark waiting to be seen again. Time moved on, quietly, like it always does. Wars came and went. New heroes filled the headlines. And Desmond Doss, the man who once lowered 75 soldiers from the mouth of hell, kept tending his garden, fixing neighbors' fences, and reading his worn Bible by lamplight. He never looked for fame. But sometimes, fame comes looking for those who never ask for it. In the 1950s, veterans who had fought alongside him began to tell his story again. They wrote letters, gave talks, tried to explain to anyone who'd listen what kind of courage they'd seen that night on Okinawa. "Without his faith," one said, "none of us would have come back." But the world was busy. The story rarely made it past small-town newspapers. It took decades for the nation to remember. In the 1990s, a documentary team tracked Doss down. They found him living quietly in Alabama, his health failing but his spirit the same.
When the cameras rolled, he looked straight into the lens with calm eyes and said, "I couldn't carry a weapon, but I could carry faith." That single line reignited something powerful. Churches, schools, and veterans groups began sharing his story again. People were stunned that such a man had really existed. No fiction could have written him better. Then, in 2016, the world saw what his soldiers had seen. Mel Gibson's film Hacksaw Ridge brought Desmond Doss back into the light. Millions watched the impossible unfold. One medic, unarmed, walking through a storm of bullets to save his brothers. For many, it was the first time they had heard his name. For others, it was a reminder that heroism doesn't always carry a gun. When the film premiered, Doss had already been gone for over a decade. He passed away in 2006 at the age of 87, quietly, as he had lived, surrounded by the peace he had earned. But his story lived on stronger than ever. People who watched Hacksaw Ridge wrote letters to his family.
Veterans said it made them rethink what courage really means. Doctors, nurses, even paramedics wrote, "I went into medicine because of him." And people of faith whispered prayers in gratitude for a man who proved that belief could survive on the battlefield. Today, his Medal of Honor rests in a museum. But that small Bible, the one that stopped a bullet, still bears the mark of war and the warmth of the hand that held it. It's more than an artifact. It's a promise. Because Doss's legacy isn't just about bravery. It's about the quiet rebellion of doing good when no one else will. About walking into chaos unarmed and unafraid. About believing that saving one life is worth risking your own. And maybe that's the lesson he left for us. That you don't need to wear a uniform to fight for what's right. You don't need a weapon to make a stand. You just need the will to act when it would be easier to stay still. So when you finish this story and go back to your world, your job, your school, your routine, ask yourself, would you climb that ridge? Would you face the fire unarmed for someone else's chance to live? Would you stay when everyone else retreats? If those questions stir something inside you, hold on to it. That's how heroes begin. Not with glory, not with power, but with faith. Desmond Doss never wanted fame. He only wanted to be of use. And maybe, in the end, that's the truest kind of legacy. To live so others might have a chance to stand, breathe, and believe again. So if his story moved you, don't just watch. Carry it. Share it. And maybe, when the time comes, whisper the same words he once did in the dark. Lord, help me get one more. There's a quiet kind of power that lives in memory. Not the kind that shouts through history books or fills museums with noise, but the kind that whispers, steady and sure, every time you wonder what one person can really do. Desmond Doss's story didn't end on Okinawa. It began there. Because every soldier who lived because of him carried that miracle into their own lives, raising families, building futures, telling children stories about the man who didn't carry a gun. Think about that. 75 men, each one with children, grandchildren, maybe great-grandchildren by now. That's hundreds, maybe thousands of lives that exist because one man refused to take a life. Can you imagine that ripple, how far it's traveled? And yet, Doss never claimed to be special. He said he was just doing what he had to do,
When asked how he found the courage to keep going up that ridge, he didn't talk about medals or strength or pride. He simply said, "I just kept asking God to help me get one more." That single prayer became his heartbeat, one more. Even when he was exhausted, even when the world told him to give up, even when it made no sense to go back into the fire again. And maybe that's what we all forget in our own battles. It's not about saving 75 people. It's about saving one life, one moment, one act of compassion that might echo further than you'll ever see. So maybe, today, your ridge isn't a battlefield. Maybe it's standing up for someone who's alone, forgiving someone who doesn't deserve it, showing kindness when it costs you something, or holding on to faith when everything around you says to let go. Because courage doesn't always look like heroism. Sometimes it looks like mercy. And if you ever wonder whether it matters, remember Desmond Doss. Remember the night he stood alone on that cliff, surrounded by hell itself, whispering into the dark, "Lord, help me get one more." That wasn't just a plea. It was a promise. A challenge, a way of life. So here's the question only you can answer. When your moment comes, when you see someone in need, when doing good feels like walking into the fire, will you take the step? Will you be one more? Because in a world that celebrates power, maybe what we really need are more people like him. Quiet, humble, unarmed, but unstoppable. And if this story moved you, don't just watch. Honor it. Carry it. Live it. Because the greatest tribute to Desmond Doss isn't in medals or movies. It's in the choices you make when no one's watching. So, when you face your own ridge and the world seems too cruel, too loud, too lost, remember this man who walked into hell with nothing but faith and came back with 75 reasons to believe that goodness still wins. Be one more, because that's how the world changes. One act of courage at a time.